Hello, everyone, and welcome to the World Software Architecture Summit. My name is Ransi, and I'm super excited to be presenting in front of you about the serverless solution architecture focused around the AWS architecture, right? So let's get started. And this is sort of like my promise for the next 30 to 40 minutes that we have. And I'm going to get the ball rolling by introducing you to what serverless is, how it evolved, and what are the advantages as compared to the other models of cloud execution, right? And I'm going to give you like a brief overview of what the serverless in the AWS ecosystem is, and what better is to just show you by a real example, right? And I have sort of like a really cool application that I've built for this demo. And I'm going to give you like a rundown of the various AWS services that we are going to be using, whether from the databases, the identity access, the Lambda functions that's going to be there, the integration with the API gateway, how you actually going to host your websites or your static content on S3, and how it can be distributed across by using the CDN services and sort of like the distribution surface with the Route 53 or sort of like the DNS redirection, right? And then the second phase of this presentation is going to be talking about the full stack serverless. So the first one is basically giving you like a rundown of the various in-depth steps that needs to be done. And the second phase is basically getting you introduced to AWS Amplify that helps you get started with the serverless solution at sort of like a different level, right? So before that, I want to give like a brief introduction about myself. So I'm a principal software engineer at Sonicwall, a few years of experience under my belt, but primarily in the cloud security and the networking domain. I am multi-cloud certified in across all the providers. Also hold a patent in cloud security around the distributed data storage. And I am a firm believer of the multi-cloud and particular interest around serverless containers and the cloud native offerings. On the community side, I lead the GDG Cloud, the AWS user group, and the cloud native community in Bangalore, speak at regular conferences, and I also have won multiple hackathons in the cloud security topics, right? And also been recognized by Google as sort of like a community influencer. So uh, with that, I want to set the context, and I want to do it by sort of like taking this definition from the Wikipedia, and all of you can read. And I'm not going to repeat this, but just look at the ones that's been underlined, right? It's sort of like the serverless. It's nothing special. It's just a cloud execution model, but it's different. But how it's different? Because the cloud provider is going to run the server for you. You are not in charge of what is going to be run, right? And because it's being run by the provider and managed dynamically. So that's the whole difference that you have to understand as to what the serverless means, right? And we want to get deeper as to what it actually means, right? So again, just to drive to the point, it's basically about building and running your applications at scale or even probably at a low scale level without actually thinking about the service. So you think only about the code and your application, and you think nothing about the capacity. And when I say the capacity, it's basically about the uh, storage, networking, and the compute. So you don't think about those sort of capacities, right? So it basically removes, or the serverless is basically removing the need for provisioning and utilization. Yes, operations are a zero management, sort of like the no ops way of actually doing it. You scale automatically, whether horizontally or vertically, and it's available across with a high amount of fault tolerance. And because it is being provided with the abstraction of the servers, because it's completely hidden, you are basically not dealing with it in that layer. And because it's event driven, so it is basically provisioned dynamically when there is sort of like an event that's been kicking, and you only pay for what you actually use. So that's sort of like the advantage that's been provided with the serverless offerings, right? So how did we actually evolve here? Because this did not happen overnight, right? And on the bottom left, you actually see the bare metal offerings that's been started, right? It's still there. You acquire the hardware and you mount it on the rack, and then that's how it all began, right? The server definitions. That's pretty much it's part of the data centers that's been there, right? And then the next evolution sort of happened with the VMware bursting the scene, and then the VMs just became the de facto standard for all of it, right? For getting your stuff done. It still is some of the most popular way of getting things, and that's evolved into the container model, right? When Solomon Hykes announced Docker in 2013, I guess, the whole containers came to the scene, and Google has been doing it at much larger scale before that, but sort of been democratized with the whole Docker perspective. And that's how the container things. And the next gradual evolution was the Lambdas that got introduced in AWS reInvent in 2014. And that's sort of like the fast definitions of doing things, where you only think about the code in how it is being run. And that's sort of like the evolution where we're getting there. So, right, from bare metal to VMs to CAS, or the containers as a service to FaaS, the functions as a service, right? So when you actually think about serverless, this is sort of like the analogy that I want to give, right? You don't actually think about the serverless just as FaaS. FaaS, as you can see, it's sort of like a piece of the pizza, right? Serverless is a whole encompassing things of other things. Like, for example, S3 is serverless, the way you actually serve, right? BigQuery from Google Cloud, that is serverless, right? Because you are not provisioning or running any of your stuff. But FaaS, or the Lambda, or the Google Cloud Function, or the Azure functions, those are not the only serverless offerings. Those are just the FaaS offerings, or small subset of the whole serverless services that exist out there, right? So with that context that's being said, I want to just introduce you to what we actually are building, and I want to give like I want to do it something fun. And what better way than to explain about all the t-shirts that I have, the various technology t-shirts that I've been collecting from the various conferences, right? So we are going to build a fun application that's going to describe about the various t-shirts of Ramsey, right? And give you like a brief introduction about what those t-shirts are and where I acquired it, right? So let's get started, right? So enough talking. I know all of you are here to see the stuff. You've paid for this conference, so let's just get started, and let's get the ball rolling, right? And here's sort of like the prerequisites that we actually need to begin. We need the AWS free tier, obviously, and all of these things that I'm going to talk about is not going to cost you a single dime. It's all going to be within the AWS free tier, right? You can get the source code from the GitHub. So I've given you the link for it. Feel free to fork or download or whatever, and then you can just get the whole source code to play around with it. And just a very bare minimum understanding of Python, most English-like language, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's not a whole understanding, but just a required amount, right? And a good IDE like a Visual Studio Code, which is again free. And this is, I am under the assumption that you already have a domain, or if you do not have, just purchase a domain and you can have it hosted over there. So I already have a domain, and we are going to host it as a subdomain for this particular application, right? So the first step is obviously setting up the database, and we are going to be using DynamoDB, which again is the serverless offering from AWS. So, right, so just select the data from the DynamoDB from the database section, create the table, and it helps you get started. So what I've done over this next few slides is, instead of giving you like a demo which would go all haywire and if the demo codes are not working, I've taken up the relevant screenshots and I've put it in the slide, so that when you get the slides, which obviously would be sharing to the organizers, you can actually go back and then look at this screenshots and then get you hands-on with it, right? Rather than just watching the video again and again, right? So just select the create table to help you get started with that. And then just provide a simple table name, a primary key. So it's sort of like a partition key. That's what we actually call in DynamoDB. So in this case, it can be like a unique identifier. We are giving you the ID for various things, right? And then just use the default settings, leave the rest as default, and then just click next, right? And you have to start adding the items by clicking on the create items, right? So what you have actually done is, I'm going to add my various items, which are going to be my t-shirts, right? So it's a very simple DB schema that is nothing but the ID and the description. So I add the ID number 1, and I'm going to give a description about one of my t-shirts that's just there, right? So with that, you keep adding whatever you want. I've done a bunch of additions for all of my t-shirts, and there you should be having a relevant database, right? Now, the next part is about the IAM. So you select the IAM from the security, identity, and compliance services in the AWS. You create a new role by clicking on it, and you select the Lambda as a service. So you're going to be using the Lambda, because it's serverless. So you want to have the Lambda as a services, which is going to be using this role. and then just click next to attach the permissions to it, right? So what are the relevant permissions that we actually want? So just select, you want the Amazon DynamoDB full access, you want the Lambda to be executed, so you just give the basic execution role for it, and then select the Lambda VPC access. So VPC is sort of like a construct within AWS that helps you set sort of like the networking perimeter within your area. So it's sort of like your own data center. Yeah, that's the analogy. Your own data center within the AWS. So that helps you give your execution within that VPC, right? And you add the appropriate tags. So this is optional, but highly recommended because it helps you from a building perspective, right? So you can add the appropriate tags for it. And you can give an appropriate name and you can just create the role. So I'm giving you the role as tees.runc.me, which you can guess right now is gonna be my website on which this is already hosted. And you attach the policies. So this is sort of like the review that's gonna be there, right? So with that, the IAM is now set. And now the third one is basically gonna be making some FaaS, right? Gonna make some FaaS, right? Fun way of doing it. Now you select the Lambda from the services list under the compute, and you provide the name, runtime, and you have to choose the role, right? So you give a function name, appropriate function name. You choose the runtime. So we're going to be writing all of our code in Python 3. So you select the runtime environment, and you create an use an existing role, right? So instead of you've created the existing role in the previous steps, you just select that from the list and it will just automatically get listed over there, right? So in this web example, so we have this show T description. So that's sort of like our only function that's going to be doing this thing, right? So we have this t-shirt that is there, and it's going to show you the t-shirts when you do a mouse over or click on top of it, right? So we've added those t-shirts in DynamoDB. It's going to now show you the description for this one, right? So for Python, when you actually have to do it, to be integrated, you have to zip all the source code and dependencies if any. So now here, we do not have any dependencies. Well, we use Boto3 for basically fetching it, but Boto is actually a dependency within the Lambda runtime. So you have your Python, this thing, you right click on it and you just say, send it to a compressed file. So your Python code is there, just make it a zip file, right? And as I said, Boto is the dependency that we have, but guess what? It's already part of the runtime. So you don't have to explicitly do or download those dependencies. And then, but if you're using some other packages within Python, just make sure that it is extracted it out. And then that is within the zip file that you actually got. So you can read more about it in the AWS documentation for Lambda for with Python. I don't want to get deep dive into it because that's sort of like a different discussion altogether, right? So now you should have the zip file which is ready to be deployed. So just verify the contents by clicking on it, and then you should have it exactly like the screenshot. That is, the Python file should definitely be available under that same hierarchy on when you open it, right? So go to the Lambda section again, and then you have to upload the zip file. So you select the zip file from there, you choose the runtime, and you have something called as a handler. Now the handler is very important, right? The format of the handler is very important in AWS Lambda. For Python, it should be Python file name dot lambda underscore handler. So we have the Python file name as show T description, I believe. Yeah, show T this. And so that name should be showtthis.lambda underscore handler. So that is the way in which the AWS Lambda is going to know that this is the file that I have to extract and then execute it. So that's sort of like the name to ID mapping, it's sort of a thing that the Lambda does internally, right? So that it gets executed. So you have to provide the appropriate description if you want to, and then just keep the memory footprint. So this is where you actually specify the saying that if you have sort of like a really large file that you want to execute and you feel that this is going to be needing more time, more capacity in terms of memory, feel free to use that slider all the way to the right, and then you will get the memory allocations as needed. But ours is sort of like a very small thing, and 128 MB of the default execution memory footprint would actually, and I'm pretty confident that it will not exceed a whole lot of time. So I'm going to keep the default timeout as well for I think 3 seconds, or maybe even like 5 seconds should be okay. You just click on save and you have the Lambda functions actually created. And once it's created, it will get listed over there as the Lambda functions that's seen there, right? So your Lambda is now ready to go, but it's just sitting there. You need to have it invoked, right? And you have to invoke it by something called as an API gateway. And that is the one which is gonna be invoking your Lambda, because you can create any number of Lambdas you want, but it's just gonna sit there. It's not gonna cost you anything, but it won't do any work. And now this is where you have to integrate it. So you choose API gateway from the networking and content delivery. You create the API. You see where this is going? So now we are going to be creating an API that's going to be invoking the Lambda, right? So you choose the protocol. So here we are going to be using the REST protocol. You are choosing a new API. You are giving the API a name, and you're choosing the description of the endpoint. So here I'm going to choose a regional endpoint, right? And now you're going to be creating the resource, right? So you choose the resource, and then you make sure that you have the API gateway CORS enabled. So CORS is, or the cross origin request, sort of like something that helps you execute a domain if it is like in a different domain. Obviously, we need the CORS to be enabled because the Lambda is going to be executed in a different one, and the API gateway is going to be there. So you want the ability for your API to be called as a separate one. So you just make sure that it is there. You provide the resource name and then enable the API gateway CORS, right? Click on create resource. So now you should be able to have the resource created. So by default, it will just create the options request, right? So that's the default, but that doesn't do anything. It's just a mock request that's just there, right? For now, you need to have to create another method or a post method. So you click on create method, you choose post from the dropdown, and then you have to now create this post method, which is now going to be invoking your Lambda function. See, so when you do that, you choose the integration type as the Lambda function, you choose the Lambda region. So I am in India, so I choose the Mumbai region, and you choose the Lambda function that's going to be, which we created earlier, right? So now you choose the region, and we have created the earlier integration that is now complete. So with that, we now have another method that is being distributed. So you have the post method that is also getting showed up, and you click that method, and you are going to enable the CORS for that particular method as well, right? So just be on the safe side, right? So leave everything is it, and you see this pop-up that is just going to come up. You enable the CORS and just replace the existing CORS errors. Nothing much. So it's just going to make sure that it is there. So now your API is basically ready, but you have to now deploy this. So you can go to the action and you choose that option called deploying the API, right? And once it's deployed, this pop-up is going to come. You choose a new stage name. You give the stage name a name, description, and the deployment description. So this is sort of like the first version of the run CCs, right? So, and then you click on deploy. So now you will see something like this. You will have the invocation URL, which will now be provided by the API gateway, which when clicked is going to trigger the AWS Lambda function, which will invoke that Python code to do all that task, right? So you see where all this is ending up right now? That's the whole integration that's just coming in. And you have to now have this invoked from the API, right? So you have this JavaScript function, which is there in that GitHub repository that I've given you, right? So now you have to use an AJAX call to basically invoke this. So you take that endpoint, you paste it in that URL that's been provided over there, and that's how you have integrated the API, which will now be invoked from the JavaScript function, right? And this is the serverless trinity that's just been coming together everything. So you have the HTML file, which has the JavaScript function. The JavaScript function has the URL, which we have now created from the API gateway. And that API gateway is going to call the Lambda function, which is being now created in the Python file. So you have the HTML code, the JavaScript code, and the Python code, which is now all going to work in a very well, good harmony, and just this serverless way, right? So that's how the whole integration is going to play out right now, right? And how it's going to be playing out is after you host your files on the S3 bucket, because hey, we have this JavaScript file, we have this HTML file, but we don't have a website yet. Yes, we have the Lambda function, which is now going to be invoked by the API gateway, but we want to see the real thing, right? We want to host this website. And this is how we're going to be hosting the website. So you choose the S3 from the services list, you click on create a bucket, and you provide the appropriate bucket name and the region. So you choose the region where you're based out of, you provide a good bucket. So runsys.com, right? Whatever the bucket name that you want, and you click on create, right? So from that, you select the bucket that you created earlier. So the bucket is ready, the teas.runsys.me, right? And you give the static website hosting. So you go to the properties tab and you choose static website hosting, right? So from that, you will automatically be given an endpoint. So now if you click on this endpoint, your website will be ready to go, right? But that's not a very large endpoint. So you have this endpoint that is being automatically being provided by the S3 when you enable this. And you give the index document. So in our case, it is index.html, which is going to be hosting this. And whenever you hit this website, it's going to redirect to index.html. It could be anything, home.html, whatever your website repository is. But in the repository example that I give, is index.html, right? That's the starting point. And then you go to the permissions tab and you have to give this bucket policy. And what this bucket policy does, it's going to make your bucket a world readable, because hey, it's a website which should be accessible to everyone, right? So that it should be readable. So this policy, you can get it from the link that I've given in the footnotes. Just pick it up and then just replace the thing that is there with the bucket ARN name with teas.runsy.me, the bucket name /star. So it's going to give you access to all the contents inside that bucket with a policy of allow, and it's going to do an action of get object. So every time you hit this, it's going to get that object, everything under that bucket, which that's /star, which is the wildcard character, right? So with that, the bucket is now public. Now we need to create a certificate. How good is the website if it isn't secure, right? So we need to have like a SSL certificate. Yes, we are gonna be making a HTTPS enabled website, not HTTP one. And that is also being provided by Serverless with the certificate manager. So you choose that service from the AWS, choose the region as North Virginia. And this is very important because the North Virginia region is the one which will provide a certificate that can be integrated into a CDN network that will come into the later, the CDN or the cloud distribution network or the cloud front in how the AWS parlance is, where it basically helps you distribute your content across the globe, but more on that later, right? So, but you make sure you choose the region as North Virginia. You click on create or request a certificate, and you request a public certificate, right? So that's the default option that's there. You give the domain name. So now I already have a domain called runsy.me. I'm going to host this as a subdomain, the teas.runsy.me. You choose that and you click next. You have to do a DNS validation. So depending on how you want to do it, my domain runsy.me is already hosted in the route 53. So I'm going to do a DNS validation because I just want to create an entry in the DNS to help me this subdomain validator, right? So when you enable that, this option default comes and you just have to click on that to create the record. And the entry would be created with the CNAME entry that would be there. So it could be in any of your, it may not be route 53, right? Because your domain could be hosted anywhere else. So just copy the CNAME entry and just paste it on your domain provider, right? And with that, the certificate would basically be issued. Usually it takes about 15 minutes after the CNAME entry is being created. That's what I observed with Route 53. So now the next step is to make your website accessible across the world. Because remember, my website is in the Mumbai region, but I would have users from Australia or Europe or North America, right? And I want that to be served very fast rather than making like a halfway trip around the world, right? So you choose something called a CDN, and the AWS provides something called a CloudFront, which is sort of like a managed CDN for that particular, the content delivery network, right? So you create a distribution, you choose the web as sort of like the delivery mechanism that you want to actually do it, and you choose the domain name. So obviously my domain name is the S3 bucket. So I'm going to choose that and it automatically gets populated over there, the domain name that's been provided, right? and you choose the protocol. So I want to redirect everyone who's going to come into this CloudFront distribution to basically redirect all the HTTP traffic to HTTPS, right? And how we're going to do that is by using that certificate that we actually created. So the CloudFront is going to be creating a default name, but I want to redirect that to a CNAME called teas.runcs.me, because CloudFront is going to be creating its own subdomain. But hey, I want my domain to be like a good user spelled domain, right? So teas.runc.me, that's my $1 million website. So I give that CNAME and I give that custom SSL certificate, so which we created earlier. So teas.runcs.me, when someone hits, it's going to hit to the CloudFront distribution, it's going to translate that, it's going to pick up the certificate, and it's going to look into the S3 bucket, right? So that's how the redirection is going to be there. We choose the default root object. So again, just like when we created the distribution earlier, so again here, the S3 bucket earlier, again here, again, we have to give the default root object. And it's the same thing depending on your website. In my case, it is index.html. You create the distribution and wait for the distribution. It actually takes about 30 minutes for this whole distribution to basically go through this whole process, right? So with that, we want to just do the DNS redirection, and we use something called a route 53 to basically do this. And you choose the host it's on that you want. So here I have a domain called runc.me that is hosted already on route 53. And that's the reason why you choose that. So you have to create a host it's on for your particular domain. Click on create the record set. And here I'm going to create the record set called teas.runcs.me. In the record type a CNAME and the value that I received with the default CloudFront domain, right? So whenever you hit teas.runcs.me, it's a CNAME domain that's going to be redirecting it to this CloudFront location, which again is going to talk to the S3 bucket. So we have created this whole redirection process that's going to serve this super cool website, right? So with that, the website should now be live, and you should all be now be able to access the teas.runcs.me super secure website. I'm just kidding. The $1 million idea will entirely with the AWS serverless components. We have not used a single EC2 instance or any bare metal instance. Like all of the components that's been just mentioned in this icons have been used, whether it be S3 bucket for hosting, the AWS Lambda that is going to be running the FaaS computations, the IAM that's going to be dictating the services of the roles, the certificate manager that we use for issuing the certificate, the route 53, the DynamoDB that's going to be our website. So all of this is now working in harmony to basically serve this for you, right? So with that, I want to shift gears a little bit and then talk about the second phase of this presentation, that is about the AWS Amplify. Now, the whole point why I've kept this later is because everyone loves to have a good hot dog, right? But sometimes you also have to learn how to make a good sausage, right? So the first phase was basically about learning to make the sausage, and the second one is about bringing it all together to make a good hot dog, right? So AWS Amplify is the hot dog, right? And what it actually provides is basically it helps you give a JavaScript library and a tool chain to help you build mobile and web apps, all powered by the cloud, right? And it helps you deploy these things fast. Now, the last 30 slides, we've been talking about multiple steps that's been needed to build a very simple static website. But with AWS Amplify, with few commands, you'll be able to do that. And I wanted to give you this power, but I wanted to give you this power after the background that we had said earlier, right? So as I said, AWS Amplify gives you that CLI support that's been there, with helps with integration, the A&A, the authentication and authorization support, and helps you integrate with the REST and the GraphQL APIs. And the tool chain, right, with various simple commands that's been provided by the tool chain. AWS uses CloudFormation in the backend to help you enable, modify, and share the configurations for your web and mobile applications, right? So the CLI and the tool chains are being provided by the Amplify. And it helps you host the static website. So it helps you distribute the content to the end users with very low latency and with the high data transfer speed. And it also provides a secure, simple, and storage infrastructure, right? The S3 we've talked about earlier. the distributing front ends of the CDN, and the cloud front end, the API gateway, and performs something better as compared to what we described earlier. It helps you give a local testing of AWS Lambda. Now, we talked about the AWS Lambda development earlier, but this AWS Amplify, it helps you give some sort of like a unit testing if you're dealing with Lambda at scale, that is with multiple functions. And this is where the true power of AWS Amplify comes in the picture. And it helps you deploy, create APIs. So we talked about the API integrations with the API gateway, right? With AWS Amplify, it is even possible, and it helps you integrate with GraphQL and also REST. But with API gateway, it was more of a REST integration. Here, it gives you support for GraphQL integrations as well. And the tool chain basically helps you integrate with implements all of your cloud formation template that implements your data model. So that's sort of like the true power that comes with it. And it's integrated with very well SPF frameworks, so the single page application frameworks, so whether it be Vue, Angular, Ionic, React, React Native, all the major providers are being helped integrated with yours. And it helps you support this integration with the various AWS services. And what are those services? Well, it helps you integration for the authentication in terms of Cognito, right? We had to use IAM in our case. The storage, yes, there is this definition for support for S3 and DynamoDB. We saw that earlier with our example in phase 1. Functions, we use AWS Lambda. Yes, that integration is being provided with AWS Amplify as well. The API integration, we saw that. You can have it with both, right? The hosting, we saw the S3 bucket hosting. The analytics, so this is something extra that the AWS Amplify provides. It helps you integrate with the pinpoint and the interactions if you want to do sort of like a NLP application with the Amazon Lex, right? So it is now safe to say that the serverless is definitely eating the stack, because we have built a classic three-tier application, including the backend, the middle layer, and the front end, using all of the services which are serverless, and whether it be in phase 1 or phase 2. I want to touch upon phase 2, but more from like a 10,000 feet overview. I don't want to deep dive it, but the phase 1, we've explored in deep dive all of the services, whether it be in the backend databases, the middle tier, or the front end, to helps you do this. And it is basically done the full stack applications without managing a single node of CPU, right? So that's the power that the serverless harnesses, right? So with that, I want to conclude, and I want to thank you everyone for listening once again. And it's been a great honor to present to all of you. Do try, if there is anything particular that you are interested, do reach out to me. This is my handle to basically reach the my website and my Twitter handle. Feel free to check it out, and then we can hopefully connect and then just take the next learning. Right? So thank you again. Thank you all for having me, and pleasure talking to you again.